He built an empire on fear and calculated silence. She vanished 4 years ago without a trace. Now she's standing in the doorway with 3 reasons he never knew existed. When a mafia boss's past walks through the door carrying his future. Every throne has a price. And tonight, his just became unpayable. This is the story of the man who controlled everything until he discovered what he'd never had. Welcome to a love that survived secrets, shadows, and the weight of a crown forged in blood. Hello everyone. I'm back with another Afro-Korean story that will haunt you long after the final word. Today's tale is about hidden truths, impossible choices, and a love fierce enough to topple an empire. But before we begin, please subscribe and help us reach our goal so we can keep bringing you stories that live in your heart. Now, let's step into the shadows. The restaurant was the kind of place where power whispered instead of shouted. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the glittering Seoul skyline, and every conversation carried the weight of fortunes being made or destroyed. Do-yoon Kang sat across from his fiancée, Ji-yeon, her engagement ring catching light like a contract written in diamonds. When the door opened and time fractured, he didn't need to look up. He felt her before he saw her. The way you feel a wound reopen before you see the blood. 4 years. 4 years since Sonia had disappeared from his life without explanation, without warning, without anything but the ghost of her perfume on his pillow. He'd torn the city apart looking for her. God, how he'd searched. Every contact activated, every debt called in, every thread of his underground empire pulled until it nearly snapped, trying to find the woman who'd vanished like rain into concrete. And now she was here. Ji-yeon was still discussing seating arrangements for their wedding reception. Her voice was polished, pleasant, the sound of a future he'd agreed to but never wanted. Do-yoon's eyes found Sonia across the restaurant, and the air between them became charged, dangerous, impossible to breathe. She was more devastating than memory had preserved. Her skin still glowed warm in the amber lighting, her natural curls framing her face like a crown she'd never needed his permission to wear. She moved with that same quiet strength that had first broken through his defenses 6 years ago. But it wasn't Sonia who made his world tilt. It was the 3 children at her side. Triplets, no older than 4, dressed in matching grey shirts, their small hands linked in a chain of trust. 3 identical boys with serious faces and careful eyes. And when the middle child glanced across the restaurant, Do-yoon saw his own gaze reflected back at him. Sharp, calculating, unmistakable. The knife in his hand clattered against the plate. Do-yoon. Ji-yeon's voice sliced through the roaring in his skull. Are you listening? He couldn't answer. Couldn't breathe. Couldn't do anything but watch as Sonia's eyes finally found his across the space that separated them, a distance that felt like continents and inches all at once. Her expression didn't shift. She didn't gasp or stumble or flee. She simply looked at him with those warm brown eyes that had once seen past the crime lord to the terrified boy underneath. And in that look, he understood everything. The truth she'd carried in silence. The decision she'd made to disappear. The life she'd built in the wreckage of what they'd been. And the 3 reasons she'd had to do it all. Yoma, I'm hungry, the youngest boy said, tugging on her sleeve. Sonia's lips curved into a smile. Not for him, never for him anymore, but for her son. Their son. I know, sweetheart. Let's find you something to eat. She moved toward a table by the window, never looking back. And Do-yoon sat frozen in his chair, watching the only thing that had ever mattered walk away from him for the second time. Except this time, she wasn't alone. This time, she had 3 pieces of him he'd never known existed. And everything he'd built, everything he'd become, everything he'd convinced himself was enough, it all crumbled into dust in the space of a heartbeat. Ji-yeon was still talking. Somewhere in the distance, a server was pouring wine. The city glittered beyond the glass, indifferent and eternal. But Do-yoon Kang, the man they called the Silent Hand, the crime lord who'd never lost his composure, sat paralyzed at a table set for 2, staring at a family of 4 that should have been his. And for the first time in his carefully controlled life, he had no idea what to do next. Do-yoon's entire existence had been built on control. Every word measured, every movement calculated, every emotion locked behind walls he'd spent 20 years constructing. Men twice his age bowed when he entered a room. Prosecutors looked the other way. Police commissioners answered his calls before their commissioners called them. But right now, watching Sonia guide 3 small boys toward a corner table, he felt like a man drowning in shallow water. Ji-yeon's hand touched his arm. Do-yoon, you're trembling. He wasn't. His hands were steady, trained through years of violence to never shake. But inside, where no one could see, he was coming apart. The middle child looked back again. That stare, analytical, measuring, too old for such a young face. Do-yoon recognized it because he'd seen it in mirrors his entire life. The way predators assess a room. The way survivors calculate exits. The way his father had looked at the world before it killed him. "I need a moment," he said, his voice coming from somewhere far away. "Now? Do-yoon, we haven't even ordered." A moment. Ji-eun's eyes narrowed, but she nodded. She understood power, even if she didn't understand him. 5 minutes. He stood, his body moving on instinct while his mind remained frozen at that table, watching Sonya help the smallest boy into a chair. She was close enough now that he could see the exhaustion beneath her composure, the way her shoulders carried weight they shouldn't have to bear alone. 4 years of questions crystallized into one devastating certainty. She'd been pregnant when she left. She'd known. And she'd chosen to raise his children in hiding rather than raise them in his shadow. The truth didn't set him free. It buried him alive. Do-yoon stood in the restaurant's hallway, one hand braced against the wall, doing mathematics that rewrote his entire history. 4 years. Sonya had vanished on a Tuesday in March, 4 years and 2 months ago. He remembered because it was the same day he'd finalized the merger with the Busan Syndicate, the deal that had made him untouchable. He'd come home to an empty apartment and a silence that had never stopped screaming. The boys looked 4, maybe 5 at most. The timeline aligned with surgical precision. She'd been carrying his children when she walked away. She'd known there were 3 lives growing inside her, 3 pieces of him that would need protection from everything he represented. And she'd made the calculation that every intelligence officer, every rival, every enemy he'd ever made would see those children not as lives but as leverage. She'd chosen their survival over her own heart. The realization hit him like a blade between the ribs. While he'd been building his empire, she'd been building humans. While he'd been negotiating territory, she'd been learning to be a mother to 3. While he'd been sitting in rooms where death was discussed over tea, his sons had been taking first steps, speaking first words, becoming people he'd never met. He'd missed everything. The pregnancy. The births. Every milestone, every moment, every memory that should have been carved into his soul was just empty space. His children were 4 years old, and he was a stranger. Worse than a stranger. He was the monster their mother had run from. The reason they'd grown up without a father. The shadow she'd spent 4 years keeping them safe from. Do-yoon closed his eyes and saw his future splitting into 2 impossible paths, the empire he'd built with blood, or the family he'd lost through violence. For the first time in his life, he didn't know which one he deserved to keep. He found her in the parking garage, buckling the boys into a modest sedan that looked nothing like the luxury she'd once lived in. His footsteps echoed off concrete, and she froze, her hand still on the middle child's seatbelt. "Sonya." She didn't turn. "Don't. I need to understand." "No." Her voice was steady, but her hand trembled as she closed the car door. "You need to let us leave. They're mine." The words came out broken, nothing like the commands he was used to giving. She finally faced him, and the fear in her eyes was worse than any weapon ever pointed at him. "They're mine. I raised them. I kept them safe. You don't get to." "I didn't know." His hands were raised, a gesture of surrender he'd never made to anyone. "Sonya, I didn't know." "I know you didn't." Her breath shook. That was the point. The silence between them was 4 years thick. "Why?" he asked, though he already understood. He needed to hear her say it. "Because I loved you too much." Tears pooled but didn't fall. "Because I couldn't watch our sons become targets. Because every rival you made would have used them to destroy you. Because I couldn't," her voice cracked. "I couldn't watch them become you." The words should have felt like an insult. Instead, they felt like absolution. "One meeting," he said quietly. "Please. Let me meet them properly. Just once." "Do-yoon. I won't take them. I won't disrupt their lives. I just need." He didn't have words for what he needed. How do you ask for pieces of a life you've already lost? Sonya studied him for a long moment, seeing something in his face that made her shoulders drop. "One meeting. Supervised. And if they're scared, we leave." "Thank you." She shook her head. "Don't thank me. Thank them for being brave enough to meet the monster in their mother's stories. She drove away, and Do-yoon stood in the empty garage, wondering which hurt more, that she'd called him a monster, or that she was right. The Children's Science Museum was bright, loud, full of laughter Do-yoon had never learned to make. He found them by the dinosaur exhibit, Sonya standing watch like a sentinel, the three boys crouched around a fossil display. Min-jae saw him first. The eldest straightened immediately, stepping in front of his brothers with the instinct of someone who'd been taught to protect. 4 years old and already a guard dog. Do-yoon recognized the posture because he'd invented it. "It's okay," Sonya said softly, though her hand rested on Min-jae's shoulder like an anchor. "This is someone I'd like you to meet." Jae, the middle child, tilted his head, studying Do-yoon with unsettling focus. Not with fear, but with the analytical detachment of someone cataloging threats. He didn't speak, just watched, and Do-yoon felt himself being dissected by a 4-year-old who'd inherited every defense mechanism he'd ever built. Sunyo, the youngest, had no such reservations. "Are you our dad?" The museum didn't go silent. Children still shrieked, exhibits still hummed, life continued around them. But in the small space between Do-yoon and his sons, the world held its breath. "Yes," Do-yoon said, kneeling to their eye level, making himself smaller, less threatening. "I am." "Where were you?" Min-jae asked, and the accusation in those small words could have felled armies. "I didn't know about you. If I had," his voice broke. "If I had known, nothing could have kept me away." Jae finally spoke, his voice quiet, precise. "Yoma says you're dangerous. Your mother is right. Then why are you here?" Min-jae demanded. Do-yoon looked at Sonya, then back at 3 pairs of eyes, 2 cautious, 1 curious, all unmistakably his. "Because I want to be better." Sunyo reached out and touched Do-yoon's hand. The contact lasted maybe 3 seconds before Min-jae pulled him back, but those 3 seconds rewrote everything Do-yoon had ever wanted. Power meant nothing. Empire meant nothing. Control meant nothing. These 3 small humans who carried his blood and her courage, this was everything. The photographs landed on the mahogany desk with the finality of a death sentence. Glossy, professional surveillance shots, Do-yoon kneeling in the science museum, Sunyo's small hand reaching toward his. Min-jae's protective stance. Jae's calculating stare. And in the background, always watching, Sonya with her hand pressed to her mouth like she was holding back something that would destroy them all. Chairman Park didn't look up from the images. He was 73, built from old money and older grudges, the kind of man who'd watched empires rise and fall with the same dispassionate interest most people reserved for weather patterns. His fingers, spotted with age but steady as stone, tapped the photo of Sunyo touching Do-yoon's hand. 3 boys, Park said, his voice like gravel settling into concrete. "How inconvenient for you." The private room in his Gangnam estate smelled of cigars and decades of power consolidated in shadows. Do-yoon sat across from him, every muscle controlled, every breath measured. This was the man who'd orchestrated his engagement to Ji-yeon. The man whose network stretched from Seoul to Singapore. The man who could make people vanish as easily as turning off a light. "They're my sons. Their leverage." Park pushed another photo forward, Sonya buckling the boys into her sedan, unaware of the camera. "And liability. You understand the difference, I trust." Do-yoon's hands remained flat on the table. "I do." "Then you understand why this ends today." Park's smile didn't reach his eyes. "The engagement proceeds as planned. You marry Ji-yeon in 3 months. You solidify our alliance. And that woman," he gestured dismissively at Sonya's image, "she takes those boys and vanishes. Properly this time. And if she doesn't?" Park's expression didn't change, but the temperature in the room dropped 10 degrees. "Then I'll handle it myself. Permanently." The penthouse stretched 40 floors above Seoul, glass walls offering the city like a kingdom laid at his feet. Do-yoon had stood here 1,000 times, watching lights flicker in buildings where men made decisions that would never touch him, where families existed in spaces his shadow couldn't reach. He'd built this view with blood and calculation, brick by careful brick of violence and control. Tonight, it looked like a cage. The surveillance photos were still in his jacket pocket, edges cutting into his chest with every breath. 3 boys who didn't know their father's name was whispered in back rooms where bodies were discussed like inventory. A woman who'd loved him enough to disappear. And Chairman Park's ultimatum, hanging in the air like smoke that wouldn't clear. Marry Ji-yeon. Abandon his sons. Let Sonya vanish into whatever grave Park would dig for her. Or refuse, and watch everything he'd failed to protect burn. The door opened without knocking. Only one person had that privilege. Sang-woo had been his lieutenant for 12 years, the kind of loyal that came from shared violence and mutual survival. He read Do-yoon's silences better than most people read words. You've been standing there for 3 hours, Sang-woo said, closing the door behind him. What do you need? Do-yoon watched his reflection in the glass, a ghost of the man who'd walked into Park's estate. The man who'd believed control was enough. The man who'd never imagined wanting anything beyond the empire he'd carved from Seoul's underbelly. I need to get out. The words felt like treason against everything he'd built. All of us. And I need Chairman Park to pay for threatening my family. Sang-woo went very still. You're talking about war. I'm talking about survival. The deception required precision. Every morning, Do-yoon met with wedding planners, selecting flowers he'd never see and approving seating charts for a future that would never arrive. Ji-yeon discussed honeymoon destinations over lunch while he nodded at appropriate intervals, his mind 3 moves ahead, calculating angles of escape she couldn't imagine. Every afternoon, he disappeared. The playground near Sonya's apartment became his classroom in fatherhood. Min-jae taught him how to push a swing at exactly the right moment. Jae showed him the correct way to build a block tower that wouldn't collapse. Sunyo just held his hand and talked about dinosaurs with a kind of trust Do-yoon didn't deserve but desperately needed to earn. Sonya watched from a bench, arms crossed, never letting her guard drop completely. But sometimes, when Sunyo laughed at something Do-yoon said, he'd catch her expression softening into something that looked dangerously close to hope. 3 more weeks, he told her the first day. Then we disappear. Into what? She'd asked. Something better than this. While Do-yoon learned to be a father, Sang-woo became an archivist of atrocities. 12 years of evidence materialized in encrypted files, shipping manifests with human cargo, wire transfers through shell corporations, photographs of bodies that would never be found, recordings of conversations where death was negotiated like stock prices. Every crime Park had committed, every sin Do-yoon had witnessed, every piece of leverage that made empires crumble. The federal prosecutor's name was Kim Min-jae, and she'd been waiting 20 years for someone to hand her Chairman Park's head. When Sang-woo laid the files on her desk, her hands trembled. Why now? She'd asked. Because some things matter more than kingdoms, Sang-woo had answered, and meant it. The Grand Joseon ballroom glittered with the kind of wealth that came from violence dressed in tailored suits. Every major crime family in Seoul had sent representatives, the Busan Syndicate, the Incheon crew, the Gangnam operators who moved drugs through luxury boutiques. Chairman Park sat at the head table like a king surveying vassals, Ji-yeon beside him in diamonds that caught light like tiny warnings. Do-yoon had chosen his suit carefully that morning. Not the armor of power he usually wore, but something softer, like a man preparing to shed a skin that no longer fit. Sonya's text sat in his pocket. We're packed. Waiting. The toasts began after the 7th course. Men stood and spoke of unity, of alliance, of the future Do-yoon's marriage would secure. Each word felt like dirt being shoveled onto a grave he was supposed to climb into willingly. Park raised his glass, eyes finding Do-yoon's across the room with the cold satisfaction of someone who believed he'd already won. To Do-yoon and Ji-yeon. May their union bring prosperity to all our families. Crystal chimed against crystal. 200 people drank to a future that was already ash. Do-yoon stood. The room went quiet with the sudden attention predators give to unexpected movement. Ji-yeon's smile froze halfway to her lips. Ji-yeon, he said, his voice carrying across marble and malice, you've been patient with me. More patient than I deserved. He pulled the engagement ring from his pocket and placed it gently on the table between them. But I can't marry you. My heart belongs to someone else. And to 3 little boys who deserve better than a father who lives in shadows. Park's face went from pale to crimson. Ji-yeon sat frozen, the diamonds at her throat suddenly looking like a noose. Excuse me, Do-yoon said, and walked toward the exit while chaos erupted behind him like a building finally allowed to burn. The raids happened at 2:47 a.m., synchronized across Seoul with military precision. Federal agents stormed Chairman Park's Gangnam estate while he was still on the phone trying to organize Do-yoon's execution. The Busan warehouse, the Incheon shipping facility, the Gangnam nightclub where books were kept in a basement safe, the luxury apartment building where product was cut and packaged, all of it fell in 17 minutes. Park was in handcuffs before his lawyer answered the phone. Prosecutor Kim Min-jae stood in his marble foyer, surrounded by 12 years of evidence finally made physical, and read him charges that would ensure he died in prison. Money laundering, human trafficking, racketeering, conspiracy to commit murder. The list took 4 minutes to complete. Across the city, Do-yoon was already gone. The witness protection transport was unmarked, anonymous, carrying 5 people who'd been erased from official records an hour before the raids began. Sonia sat with Sunyo asleep against her shoulder, Min-jun's head in her lap, Jae pressed against the window watching Seoul disappear into distance and memory. Do-yoon's testimony took 6 weeks. He sat in sterile rooms and dismantled everything he'd built, speaking names into microphones that would send dozens of men to cells they'd never leave. His empire crumbled in real time, associates arrested, operations shut down, the careful architecture of violence he constructed collapsing into evidence bags and federal databases. When it was finished, they gave him a passport with a name he'd never heard before. Vancouver smelled like rain and salt water and possibility. The apartment was small, ordinary, the kind of place where neighbors said hello and meant it. No marble floors. No floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking kingdoms. Just 3 bedrooms, a kitchen with morning light, and a future that wasn't written in blood. Sonia stood in the doorway watching Do-yoon help the boys unpack boxes, and something that looked like forgiveness softened the edges of her smile.